Hey everybody, this is the introduction and the prefaces and stuff like that of The Logic of Marx by, and I'm gonna fuck up this guy's name because I don't know, it doesn't sound quite right coming out of the translator. He's from Czechoslovakia.
Jindřich Zelený.
Jindřich Zelený. Who knows if that's right or not. The Logic of Marx by Jindřich Zelený, translated and edited by Terrell Carver. The contents of this book are the translator's foreword, author's foreword to the German edition, author's introduction. I'm going to be reading all them in this video. Part 1 of the book is titled Analysis in Marx's Capital. Chapter 1, Marx on, quote, scientific explanation, end quote. Chapter 2, the transformation of concepts. Chapter 3, forms of reality and thought. Chapter 4, the starting point. Chapter 5, theory and history. Grushin's interpretation. Chapter 6, dialectical derivation, Marx's new conception of logic, methods. Chapter 7, causal relations, causality and contradiction. Chapter 8, mathematics and Marxian analysis, mathematics. Chapter 9, appearance and essence. Chapter 10, analysis and synthesis in Marx's presentation. Chapter 11, structural genetic analysis. Part 2 of the book is titled The Marxian Critique of Hegel. Chapter 12 has the headings. I thought they were originally, what I was reading were titles, but they appear to be headings because there's multiple of them. The Critique of Hegel in the Paris Manuscript. This is chapter 12. The Critique of Hegel in the Paris Manuscripts. The Negation of the Negation. Hegel's, quote, apparently critical, end quote, position. Objectivity and objectification. Logic and Encyclopedia. Chapter 13, The Holy Family. Chapter 14, The German Ideology, The Critical Method, The End of Philosophy, Marx and Stirner, The Active Individual, Hegelian Philosophy as a Unification of Spinoza and Fichte, It is not sufficient to make Feuerbach practical, Marx and Ruge. Chapter 15, The Poverty of Philosophy, Chapter 16, Stages in the Marxian Critique of Hegel. Chapter 17, A New Type of Rationality and the Suppression of Traditional Ontology. Part 3 of the book is titled Being, Praxis, and Reason. Chapter 18, Kant and Marx. Chapter 19, The Supersession of Traditional Ontology. Chapter 20, Praxis and Reason. And this is the translator's foreword. Marx, though not a professional, was no mean philosopher, and to put his views into philosophical context is no small achievement. Professor Zelený, let me try this again.
Jindřich Zelený.
Zelený. Professor Zelený has taken this project further with more success than anyone else. The problems are enormous. In comparison with the philosophies of his predecessors and contemporaries, Marx's views are revolutionary in a philosophical as well as in a validly political sense. This is still true. It is not surprising that the depth and originality of Marx's philosophical work has only recently been acknowledged, but little has been said beyond introduction and paraphrase. Zelený is one of the first commentators to work with a clear distinction between textual paraphrase and critical analysis, and Zelený rightly observes that the former is no substitute for the latter. The strength of Zeleny's book lies in Zeleny's expansion of critical analysis to include an overall characterization of Marx's views on logic and science, not merely in themselves, but with reference to preceding, contemporary, and modern schools of thought. Definitions of logic and science are required, and then general characterizations of relevant methods, and views in the history of philosophical thinking on these subjects from Aristotle to the present. It takes a brave scholar to work at this level of generalization, and the rewards are substantial. Not only do we have a view of Marx's philosophical work as a whole, we see it in contrast to other views. Some of these, perhaps the classical or transcendental traditions, may be unfamiliar, while empiricism and mathematical logic may seem more familiar to the English reader. But the logic of Marx represents more than a taxonomic exercise in the history of philosophy. Since Zelený is successful in pressing us to look critically at whichever tradition seems comfortable. What does it presuppose? What questions are put? How are they answered? What other answers does it permit? What other ways are there of asking these questions? What other questions might we ask instead? What other presuppositions are plausible? And how do we justify holding any presuppositions at all? Zelený, make sure I'm saying that right again.
Jindřich Zelený.
Zelený is ready with views on logic and science that fall within a, quote, clarified Marxist approach, end quote. Zelený is wholly original in the way that his clarifications incorporate the work of 20th century philosophers outside the Marxist tradition. This is particularly true with reference to logic. No one else has given such penetrating consideration to the precise tenets of Hegelian logic and exactly what Marx adopted from them. Zelený pursues this inquiry and also reaches stimulating conclusions concerning the non-Hegelian aspects of Marx's logic and the relation of that residue to the work of Russell, Carnap, and Tarski. Philosophical consideration of logic and science need no longer be divided between Hegelians and everyone else. For some, the whole project of putting Marx's views into a philosophical context will arouse misgivings. Marx was not a professional philosopher, and Marx was hostile to philosophy as practiced by professionals. Zelený considers very carefully Marx's views on the negation and end of philosophy, and the student of this particular issue will find the essential text quoted and assessed. Marx's, quote, positive science, end quote, Marx's, quote, practical materialism, was by his own admission, quote, not devoid of premises, end quote, and it is from these views that Marx's own work developed. From that arises the task of making sense of the Marxian enterprise, and this might legitimately, even for Marx, be considered a clarified philosophical approach. Marx could hardly have been hostile to understanding knowledge and truth, and he is reported quite in character, I think, to have said briskly to an acquaintance, quote, ignorance never yet helped anybody, end quote. On his own terms, Marx was right in pursuing his critique of political economy rather than a treatise on his premises, and the premises for holding premises. In his manuscripts, we have notes made for, quote, self-clarification, end quote. In his published critique, we have a work that follows on from these studies, alludes to them at times, and occasionally adds a further clarification. Marx was highly conscious not only of the reasons for undertaking a critique of political economy, but also of the correct methods to employ. Again, the relevant passages are extracted and given critical consideration by Zelený, who uses the early works, the Grundrisse, and the later writings with equal sensitivity. By linking the late works with the early writings in ways that are very well defended, Zelený is in a position to tackle the philosophical aspects of Marx's Capital, a work that contains some of the most philosophically exciting passages in Marx. Students of contemporary Marxism will also see in Zeleny's work a unique capacity to consider recent commentators from both East and West, Soviet philosophers such as Ryazanov, Rubin, Mankovsky, Ilenkov, Grushin, and Mamardashvili, Eastern Europeans such as Lukács, Ajdukovits, Filkorn, Zeus, Kozik, and Cibulka, Western commentators such as Cornu. I don't know if Cornu counts. Cornu was French, but I think he taught in the GDR, so it's a little. Hippolyte, Calvez, Poppets, Luvit, Lefebvre, Marcuse, and Althusser. And students of methodological questions in particular will note his extended use of Marx's manuscript, Introduction of 1857, and his Notes on Adolf Wagner, of 1879 to 80. No writer on the ontological, epistemological, philosophical, logical, and scientific issues raised by Marx could hope to satisfy all his critics, and Zeleny's work is quite consciously no exception. But one of its many virtues is that Zeleny is asking the right questions. In translating Zeleny's work, I have adopted certain principles that, as it happens, reflect his own philosophical enterprise. Anyone attempting to render philosophical works from one tradition into a language that is the medium for a quite different kind of philosophy runs into this problem. How does one deal with, quote, foreign concepts? Does the translator simply render those concepts in the original language, confronting the reader with a mass of incomprehensible italic? Is it perhaps better to create a realm of neologisms, a popular practice at present? I've tried rather to stretch the English language just enough to cover concepts from the German philosophical tradition, without, I hope, lapsing into a discourse that is not English. This does not require the representation of thoughts in English that are somewhat foreign to the native philosophical tradition, and this is necessarily not easy reading, but I have tried not to damage the language as such, and I beg the reader to keep this in mind. Zeleny's own attempt to render Hegelian and mathematical logic intelligible to students of each tradition bears a certain similarity to my intentions. In the English text, square brackets indicate my insertion by the translator, unless the initials JZ appear. J-A-Y hyphen, controlling, manipulating. Sorry. In the English text, God, I'm funny. In the English text, square brackets indicate an insertion by the translator unless the initials JZ appear. It may help the reader to be reminded of or informed that a, quote, determination, end quote, is a, quote, determining attribute, end quote. A, quote, moment, end quote, is, quote, one of the elements of a complex conceptual entity, end quote. And that, quote, ideal, end quote, appears frequently with reference to something, quote, existing only in idea, end quote. Gnoseology, I don't know if I'm saying that word right, is, quote, the philosophy of cognition, end quote, and epistemology, the, quote, science of the methods or grounds of knowledge, end quote. Quote, apperception, end quote, is, quote, the mind's perception of the mind's self as a conscious agent, self-conscious, end quote. Quote, aporia, end quote, are matters of doubt. A, quote, antheme, end quote, is a, quote, syllogism in which one premise is suppressed, end quote. And, quote, praxis, end quote, refers to, quote, the practice or exercise or a technical subject, the, quote, the practice or exercise of a technical subject or art, end quote. For a general discussion of reflex theory and epistemology, see David Hillel Rubin's Marxism and Materialism, published in 1979. Titles of books or articles appearing in foreign language in the text are rendered in English, unless the title is such as to defy translation. In the notes, I refer the reader to English translations where available. In a very few cases, I have translated a passage from a cited work myself, for example, Marx's Capital, and then referred the reader to an English translation for comparison. Some of the amplificatory quotation and comment that appear in footnotes to Die Wissenschaftslogik by Marx und das Kapital has been omitted in order to produce this translation as economically as possible. I have kept the numbering in the notes to this edition the same as in the edition of 1968, except where the author's revisions of 1978 have indicated otherwise. In conclusion, I should like to thank Professor Zeleny very warmly for supplying me with a useful list of corrections to his German text and for his encouragement. Terrell Carver. Author's foreword to the German edition. My, quote, introduction provides a preliminary account of the questions out of which the present inquiry developed and of the way I attempt to examine the problems encountered. Here I merely note that the monograph on the logical structure of capital, which was published in 1962 in Czech, forms the basis of the German translation. The continuation of my studies led in the intervening years to a more thoroughgoing preoccupation with Marx's critique of Hegel. The present work pursues the results of previous inquiries into the logical structures of capital, while familiarizing the German reader with the Marxian conception of rationality and the supersession of traditional ontology as a whole. The vitality and breadth of the dialogue which arose in the French periodicals La Nouvelle Critique, Le Thème Moderne, et al., in the mid-1960s concerning my point of view may serve as an indication of the reality and theoretical interests of the problems treated there. The present work may be regarded as a contribution to that debate. Jindřich, how was it? Let's try it again.
Jindřich Zelený. Jindřich Zelený.
Jindřich Zelený. Prague, 31st of January, 1967. Things are about to get wild in Prague. I wonder what Zeleny's relationship to that was. Alright, so here we are. Author's introduction. The present work is in large part an interpretive study of Marx. Its brief is not, however, purely historical, since it breaks new ground in certain essential respects. The first part characterizes dialectical materialist analysis in the specific form in which it appears in Marx's Capital. To do this, I draw on other Marxian works and manuscripts directly connected with this masterpiece, above all the manuscript of the first draft of Capital, published in English as Grundrisse. This inquiry, which takes us from descriptive and explanatory analysis of textual detail to deeper philosophical and logical issues, prepares the way for an investigation of a more general question. In what sense does Marxism constitute a revolution in our conception of science? What is the logical content of this revolution? What has Marx contributed to the discussion of questions raised in modern philosophy by the Novum Organum of Bacon, the Discourse on Method by Descartes, Locke's essay concerning human understanding, the new essays by Leibniz, Kant's two critiques, Hegel's phenomenology of mind and science of logic? When we inquire into the question of whether the structural genetic analysis employed in Capital possesses a general applicability as a new type of scientific thought, we come swiftly to the conclusion that the answer presupposes a clarification of Marx's relationship to traditional European metaphysics. In this way, the problem of the logic of capital leads us to a consideration of the Marxian critique of Hegel. Marx's critique of bourgeois political economy and Marx's critique of Hegel have an indissoluble inner unity and appear as a coherent whole when we consider in what respect Marx's work constitutes a revolutionary departure in our understanding of rationality. In my concluding chapters, I attempt on the basis of the preceding analysis to establish that Marxism implies the supersession of the traditional opposition of gnoseology and ontology. This yields a new philosophical method for the investigation of the first principles of logic, which I call, quote, ontopraxeologic, end quote. The present work refers, favorably as well as critically, to previous Marxist-Leninist literature concerned with the question of what new conception of logic is contained explicitly and implicitly in Marx's work. One second. There's a footnote. Or not a footnote, an endnote, and I gotta find that. Sorry. 1 second. 2. Okay. Yeah, the footnote doesn't say anything. It looks like the footnotes are just citations, oftentimes for books that are in foreign languages, so I'm not even going to bother. Anyway, where am I? In my opinion, there are grounds for regarding as unsatisfactory the results of previous Marxist-Leninist attempts to clarify the relationship of the materialist dialectic and analytical scientific theory. Given the present state of the problem, it seems fitting to return to the question of the logical structure of Marx's Capital, since this, in my view, is the means by which our modern understanding of rationality from the Marxist standpoint can be deepened. It is, to be sure, a new point of view, a return within the perspective of the contemporary problem of so-called dialectical and analytical rationality, reculer pour mieux sauter. In this respect, the present work takes up Lenin's comment on the necessity and fruitfulness of studying the logical structure of Marx's masterwork. See Lenin's philosophical notebooks. The return to the problem of the logic of capital makes it possible, in my opinion, to work out criteria for the debate in contemporary Marxist thought concerning the schism between anthropological and scientific presuppositions. I suppose there he's referring to the question of humanism and anti-humanism. People put forward a humanist perspective versus those who put on a scientific anti-humanist perspective, like Althusser. Let us now consider an introductory definition. Of course, I cannot deal here with all the relevant concepts or with the discussion of other viewpoints. The present inquiry merely endeavors to provide a few preconditions for the answer to questions usually subsumed under the problem of the relationship of formal and dialectical logic. I will not deal here with all these controversies. Rather, it is the purpose of introductory definitions to make clear to the reader, as far as possible, the connotations of the concepts we are using. Hence, the reader might reserve judgment on the justification or lack of it for these definitions until he has read the complete work. By logic, I mean the science of forms of thought leading to knowledge of objective truth. Logic is concerned above all with the forms of thought which we find in theoretical science, how they are used, and how this appears in the development of the sciences during the last millennium or more, particularly in the modern sciences. The expression, quote, to examine the, quote, logic of Marx's Capital, unquote, is obviously metaphorical. It means an inquiry into what sort of logic, what concepts and solutions to problems in logic are contained implicitly in the economic work of Marx. To think is at the same time to perceive. It is a constituent part of the process of perception, which always exists as an aspect of human praxis. Since logic as the theory of thought is a constituent part of the process of perception, it is a part of the theory of perception. It is a part of the theory of perception. Logic forms the primary part of the theory of perception. The basic problem of the theory of perception and logic, understood as questions about the nature and types of rationality, are to be taken as ontopraxeological problems. The theory of perception includes, besides logical problems, those concerned with forms of thought, the so-called rational stage of perception, from truth content up to questions of the dependence of our perceptions on physiological processes, questions of the relativity of perception to physical conditions, etc. The Marxist theory of perception returns to problems covered by German transcendental philosophy in the philosophy of the identity of thought and being. It returns, on a fundamentally new level, to an understanding of the relations of thought and reality, which emphasize their non-identity and the reflexive character of perception. The copy theory is the foundation on which the whole Marxist theory of perception, and hence the theory of logic, is built. Certain logical problems can be investigated and solved if we abstract from the copy projection model of perception, but the copy theory becomes necessary for the later phases of this inquiry, when the presuppositions, or more specifically, the limits of the, quote, formalistic, end quote, inquiry and solution are sought. Today, the logical mode of inquiry is not well understood, since logic is strictly divided into two parts, of which one is said to be formal and in no way concerned with content, the other concerned with content in no way formal. On the contrary, it seems correct to classify forms of thought, and hence also logical problems, according to their different fields. These fields possess a relative independence. These fields are detached from other questions which the development of logic puts forward. Thus, in the last 100 years, the part of logic concerned with entailment, the formal, quote, consequence, end quote, has become distinctly separate. Some logicians limit the definition of logic exclusively to that field. So these logicians call the logical problems that remain, quote, philosophical problems of logic, end quote, gnoseological problems of logic, end quote, or, quote, problems of the theory of logic, end quote, and distinguish them from the, quote, purely logical, end quote, or, quote, properly logical, end quote. The dispute over a comprehensive or narrow usage of the concept of logic appears to be a terminological dispute without significance, to be resolved by convention. But in my view, there are weighty arguments in favor of the comprehensive conception, particularly if we take into consideration the development, contemporary and future, of Marxist logical investigations. The development of the theory of entailment leads to problems. For example, the problem of the limits of formalization, semantic problems of interpretation, etc., which one can scarcely call, quote, purely logical, end quote, in the narrow sense. If they are located outside the bounds of logic as a specific discipline, then this might restrict further development. There are analogies in other sciences, for example, physics, in which there are problems in different fields. There are physical problems which consist in describing empirical properties of particular processes, to observe, to measure correctly. There are physical inquiries into the functional constituents of empirical bodies, which characterize physical processes. Moreover, there are physical theories constructed with different degrees of generalization, using the empirical verification of physical perceptions as a basis. It is clear that these physical theories belong to physics as a whole. The understanding outlined here does not entail the dissolution of the logic of entailment into gnoseological questions. Their relative independence is preserved, and only the sharp delimitation of the so-called purely logical from the rest of the logical in our sense is rejected. The different fields of modern logical investigation can be set out to illustrate my remarks as follows. 1. The theory of entailment. Today it comprises the logic of propositions, logic of predicates, logic of classes, etc. Formalization is its most important methodological procedure. 2. The theory of logical probabilities. 3. Formalization is itself an object of logical inquiry. Formalization poses questions of the possibility, limits, and logical character of formalization as such. 4. Connected with that is the problem of the interpretation of formal systems, the problem of model building. It is investigated A, in general, equal to the relationship of syntax and semantics in logic, B, in its application to specialized disciplines. The range of tasks named under points 2, 3, and 4 form, in my judgment, the different branches implied under point 1, into which logic is differentiated as a consequence of the elaboration, development and supersession of the narrowly, quote, formalistic, end quote, conception of logic. The following points 5 and 6, on the other hand, deal with logical problems from a complex point of view, in that they contain and presuppose in a certain sense the previous points. 5. The problem of the construction of a scientific system in general, not only axiomatic but also systems of the type of Marx's Capital, etc. This in the following point can be designated methodological tasks. If in conceiving logical relations, the copy theory of perception and the theory of systems are emphasized, as is the case in the present work, then, quote, logic approaches, quote, methodology, and becomes, if we press the point, identical with it. Six, the problem of the logical types of scientific thought, the typology of logic. In this point, which does not attempt an exact classification, certain points overlap in part. But even if an exact classification were proposed as an experiment, no unambiguous arrangement would result, since logic is still more dimensions. The present study is mainly concerned with the logical problems outlined under points 5 and 6. Hence, the fields of logic listed under points 1 through 4 are merely touched on to a greater or lesser degree. It is generally recognized that history has generated up to now different types of scientific thought. There is less agreement on how to characterize a type of scientific thought, how the difference between those types is to be explained, etc. As far as Marxism is concerned, it is clear, broadly speaking, that Marxism's development was conditioned by a relatively high level of maturity of the capitalist economic formation and the beginning of the revolutionary workers' movement. Up to now, more attention has generally been devoted to the dependence of Marxism and bourgeois thought on certain forms of social life than to the analysis of the fundamental theoretical, logical forms in which a revolutionary break was realized, the break with traditional theory occasioned by the development of Marxism. See Engels to Mering, 14th of July, 1893. A type of logic is characterized in theoretical terms by the logical categories explicitly expressed or used implicitly, and by the general methodological procedure which accompanies it. The investigation of logical type in scientific thought is a more abstract question than the investigation of scientific thought with any specific discipline. Thus, the, quote, logic of capital, unquote, could be an investigation into the specialized methods of political economy. Naturally, one cannot completely separate the two investigations from each other. It is rather a question of priorities. In this investigation, we examine the, quote, logic of capital, unquote, with respect to the originality and specific character of the Marxist logical type of scientific thought, the new type of rationality. The present study is intended to promote further work on the fundamental logical problems of contemporary Marxism-Leninism by means of a clarified Marxist approach. And that is the end of the author's introduction and the end of this video. Thank you so much for listening.